Scott Sayare he came all the way from Paris to talk to us. He's written for the New York Times and The Atlantic. Welcome, Scott.
First of all, thank you. I'm Scott. I'm a magazine reporter. I'm a former New York Times correspondent, and I've been living in Europe, in France for the past 7 years, and have covered jihadist terror in France and Europe a lot, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Just very quickly, a caveat as a writer. This stuff is all very complicated and complex, and it's easy for someone to sound a little bit more trenchant and definite about one's ideas, speaking aloud as opposed to on paper. And so I don't want you to think that I actually fully believe the politics behind every statement if it sounds particularly strident. So with that said, there are basically three things that I want to do, and I'll truncate the last one if there's not time. But I wanted to sort of first talk about what's going on in Europe at the moment, which is sort of a mess. And then secondly, speak to the specific example of France, and there are good reasons to look at France in particular, which I'll explain. And then briefly at the end, talk about sort of being a journalist who has covered this, and looking back at what has been written and said before, with a little bit of historical distance now. Basically, to draw the conclusion that in fact what we think we know about jihadist terror in particular might not actually be real. That is to say that things are somewhat more complicated than some of the mythology that we've learned. So to begin with what's going on in Europe, I think the basic point that I'd like to make is that it's terrifying and awful, but it's not new, and I think that's often forgotten in the way that we discuss this and cover it even as journalists today. And I'm not talking about London and 7/7. I'm not talking about Madrid in 2004. I'm going back to the 1990s at least, and in particular the Algerian War, the Algerian Civil War, which basically starts in 1992. I guess I never know if people are familiar with this stuff, but if I start to sound, if I start talking about things that you simply don't understand, raise a hand or something, and I'll add some more detail. But it goes back to the Algerian War and the birth of an Islamic group called the GIA, several Islamic groups actually in Algeria, and the exportation of that violence into France in particular. But it also goes back to the Chechen Jihad. It goes back to the Bosnian Jihad before that. Essentially, there's a path that can be easily drawn that leads us from the early 1990s up through Afghanistan, up through the bombings of the mid 2000s to where we are today in terms of jihadist terror in Europe. And I'll sort of give you an example of that. There's a guy named Khaled Kelkal who's very famous in France, in large part because he was killed on television. He was a member of the GIA, which is to say the Algerian jihadist group fighting in Algeria, but that also committed a string of bombings, for example, in Paris in 1995, in 1994. On Christmas, they had hijacked an airliner going from Algiers to Paris. Basically, this is a time of some hysteria in France. Kelkal is one of the bombers, and he's sort of chased. He becomes the most wanted man in France, and he's finally found, and he's killed by some gendarmes. While there are television cameras present, and it ends up on the evening news. Anyway, Kelkal is an event. His death is an event. It's an event that affected people. And one of the people that affected is this guy named Kamel Daoudi, who's a young Algerian growing up in Paris, very smart guy, was sort of on a trajectory to become a highly successful engineer, aeronautical engineer. But he sees Khalid Kelkal die, who, like him, is a young Algerian man living in France, and he feels something. And this is part of what will drive him to become a jihadist. Kamel spends a lot of time with this other guy named Jamel Begal. Begal is also an Algerian, also living in France, and becomes something of a mentor to Kamel, also horrified by what happens to Khalid Kelkal. There's another guy who knows Khalid Kelkal, who's one of the guys sort of in his little network from around the area of Lyon in France, whose name is Farid Melouk. He's a Frenchman of Algerian origin, to whom I'll come back later. But basically, from Kelkal, you can get to Kamel Daoudi and Jamel Begal and Farid Melouk. These guys end up in prison, essentially preventively, and I'll talk a little bit about that before. In prison, they meet the men who subsequently become the killers at Charlie Hebdo. They also end up in Syria once they get out of prison, in the case of Farid Melouk, where Melouk apparently meets with Abdelhamid Abaaoud, who is one of the supposed masterminds of the Paris attacks. He's the guy who wore the orange shoes, if you followed that. He's a Belgian, a Moroccan Belgian, grew up in Brussels, in Molenbeek. The point here is that there is a path. These guys didn't come out of nowhere. They're not just delinquents who saw some ISIS fanboy videos and decided to go join the jihad. There is a path. And part of what's going on today is Europe's failure to understand that and to act in particular preventively. The Europeans understood jihad well in advance of international jihad, well in advance of the Americans, to be sure, for having dealt with it on their soil, and put in place quite early a whole series of systems that were fairly effective in stopping people that they had already identified as threats. What they missed was the transition away from foreign ideologues arriving on their soil for the purposes of political asylum, for example, to young delinquents from the marginalized neighborhoods, in the case of France, around the big cities, in the case of Belgium, in the middle of the city, in the case of Brussels. Essentially, they missed that this would become a problem, that the ideologues would then convert the young delinquents, and that the young delinquents would then want to do jihad. We started to see it with the Iraqi Jihad in 2004, young Europeans going to Fallujah, and it's only gotten worse since then. So basically, prevention is a huge problem, and one that frankly the Europeans are talking very little about, and only beginning to talk about now. One of the big problems with what's going on in Europe right now, Europe, which has sent maybe 5,000 or 6,000, depending on the estimate, 5,000 or 6,000 fighters to the Syrian Jihad. I guess you've sort of got a perfect storm going on. You have these post-colonial populations that feel terribly marginalized and are angry to begin with. You have a jihad that's easy to get to, which I think is sort of an underappreciated element of what's going on. It's not very hard to go from Central Europe to Turkey and then cross the border into Syria. In a way that, for example, if you're an American, it might be a little bit more complicated. Those are quick flights, they're cheap flights. It's easy to get there. Unfortunately, at least in my analysis, what we've seen since these attacks, instead of a shift towards prevention, or not even a shift towards prevention, but the development of some sort of prevention, has been a doubling down on the repressive tactics of yore. In the French case, there have been two particularly destructive, as best I can tell, and this is not only my view, but particularly destructive choices. One was to institute a state of emergency after the November attacks. This state of emergency allows for warrantless searches and seizures and arrests, It allows the authorities to place people under house arrest arbitrarily, effectively, without the involvement of any sort of judge. And they've used it to great effect. Unfortunately, there's almost no terrorism cases that have been built out of all of the thousands of searches that they've conducted and all of the hundreds of arrests and house arrests. But they have succeeded in creating a great deal of animosity towards the government within the Muslim community in France. I simply don't understand what the logic, unless it was a sort of base political logic, could have been for doing something like that, unless it was potentially simply a continuation of what they've been doing for a long time, which is to say, fairly effective repressive tactics. The other thing that the French have done, or almost did, was to propose the stripping of nationality for terror suspects, but only terror suspects who have dual nationality. And if you look at the numbers, it turns out the people who have dual nationality, which is to say French nationality and another nationality, 2/3 of them are North African Arabs. And the French would never say that because it would be discriminatory. But they essentially decided that it was going to be valuable for them to stigmatize this population. They acknowledged that it would be little more than a symbol. It's hard to imagine that any terrorist would ever decide, I was going to do my martyrdom operation, but I really want my French passport. They admitted that it was a symbol, and they took the responsibility for the symbol. Why, again, is a little bit beyond me. Because we've been talking about France, just to talk a little bit more about the sort of specifics of their system, I think one thing that's important to understand about the way that the French have dealt with terrorism, domestic terrorism, since the mid-1990s, is that they have avoided Guantanamo, which is to say they have made a real effort to keep terrorism within the standard judicial process. In order to do that, however, they have created a sort of law of exception that treats these cases differently. There are specific statutes that apply. And what these statutes allow is basically preventive arrests and preventive imprisonment. There are perspectives on this, obviously, on both sides. There are those who say this is the only way that we can possibly keep ourselves safe, because we need to stop people before they commit violence. There are others who say that this is, an abrogation of human rights and completely unacceptable. What is a point of agreement is that they have imprisoned a fair number of people who really didn't deserve to be imprisoned because they hadn't committed any sort of violence, and it's impossible to prove that they had any intent to commit that violence. Again, this is a tactic that has unfortunately engendered a lot of animosity towards the government within the populations that are the at-risk populations, which is to say marginalized Arabs in particular, but not only Arabs. Muslims in general, I think, is probably a better way to put it. The problem, in addition to the sort of rights considerations that I brought up, the problem with the French system is also that it's quite short-sighted. The statute that is applied to put people in jail preventively is a statute called Association de malfaiteurs terroristes, which basically means association of terrorist criminals, to translate sort of broadly. And the problem with this statute is that you can only use it, or I guess the maximum sentence is only 10 years. So people go in and then they get out. The issue is that the French never really thought about what would happen to these guys when they did get out. This is legislation that was passed in order to neutralize these people, to use the term that they like, and it's quite effective at that. The problem is, in prison, they meet with lots of other people and convert them to their cause. And then when they get out, they continue doing what they were doing before. Only now is the country sort of beginning to think about how to deal with it in a more effective way. Essentially, the thought had been, until now, until the advent of the Syrian Jihad, that these guys would leave prison, you'd send a few guys to watch them, and everything would work out for the best. The problem with the Syrian Jihad is that France, which has sent the largest number of foreign fighters, foreign European fighters, to the jihad, there's something like 2,000 of them, either physically there at the moment, in transit, who have described some sort of desire to go, or on their way back in prison, or dead on the battlefield. The French are completely overwhelmed. They no longer have enough people to monitor everybody. They no longer have enough people to monitor everybody who they're releasing from jail. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that they've got a system, and in many ways it's the most developed system in Western Europe to fight terrorism and jihadist terrorism in particular. But it's a system that is a short-term system. There's no medium-term, there's no long-term vision about how to deal with terrorism and jihadism, Salafi jihadism, as a phenomenon of society, something that's not imported, but something that is there. I suppose to very briefly to sort of talk about what we know. I had the good fortune to do a lot of research for a recent article on a case that heavily involved the sort of turn of the century period in Afghanistan, to take an example. And this is obviously a period of time that's of interest to Americans and lots of other people, because it's the period of time when 9/11 was sort of being plotted. And it was the heyday of the Arab Afghans, the second round in Afghanistan. The discovery that I made is essentially that we don't actually know much of anything about what was going on there, or at least the public doesn't know much of anything, or people like me don't know much of anything. Which is to say, we have a sort of broad vision that has been given to us by the authorities. Whatever bits they've been willing to feed, we've taken. But in fact, in interrogating it a little more closely, it turns out that our granular knowledge of the period is basically non-existent. And just to give some examples, or I guess to give an example in particular, I studied, for this piece, I studied the case of a guy who's been presented as basically as an Al-Qaeda lieutenant. And it turns out that there's actually no evidence that he was ever a member of Al-Qaeda. But he was a member of this whole other group that, unless you're a specialist, you've never heard of. And the internal dynamics of this group were never understood. It's sort of a black box. Only now is this history being written. But when you go back and read all of the press accounts and all of the public accounts of this man's history, he is presented as an Al-Qaeda guy. He is presented as a tremendous threat, and it's hard to know in looking more closely. And looking more closely means interviewing the people who know him, interviewing him, looking at the court documents that that one can get one's hands on, looking at the American documents that one can get one's hands on at NARA. You realize that quite simply the story is not so clear, and I suppose what my hope is for myself within my own work is to sort of muddy the waters around international jihad. I think, as everyone's said thus far, these questions are in fact much more complex than we often account for. The notion of who becomes a jihadist, to suggest that there's the ideologues, and then there's the angry guys, and then there's the young guys who are just out for violence, is obviously a vast oversimplification. But these are mental structures that we fall into quite easily, and that also make for great stories. And I think it's incumbent on people like me, on journalists, and on those who study these things, to explain to the world that, in fact, things aren't that straightforward. And it might not fit a great narrative, but that's the truth. I suppose that's it. I hope we have some time to discuss things, but thank you very much.